strengthening our faith through creation. And we had gotten down through day 5, or day 4. And so this morning what I'd like to do is try to finish up this series and looking at creation and strengthening our faith through creation. And today we're going to look at day 5 and day 6. There's a lot in both of those days, really more in day 6. And we don't have the time to always cover everything that is there. But as we have done in the past, is we've gone and looked at God's creation and looked at how crazy evolution is. But knowing that the facts that are there shows us the truth about His creation. Hopefully you have a handout this morning. Our outline is in there with some fill in the blanks. And so as we go through, first thing I want to look at is day 5. And that's going to be verse 20 through 23. Genesis chapter 1, verse 20 through 23. It says, "Then God said, 'Let the waters abound with an abundance of living creatures, and let birds fly above the earth across the face of the firmament of the heavens.' So God created great sea creatures and every living thing that moves, with which the waters abounded, according to their kind, and every winged bird according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. And God blessed them, saying, 'Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the waters and the seas, and let birds multiply on the earth.' So the evening and the morning were the 5th day." And so day 5, God created living creatures in water. That's what we want to look at first. The living creatures that were in water. Now, the King James really doesn't do the best at translating these verses because it says, "Let the waters abound with abundance." And then verse 22, it says that moves which in the water abounded. So it kind of gives the impression that these creatures just happen to come from the water, but yet we know it's God spoke it into existence. God said, "Let the waters abound with these creatures," and they did. The word abound, if you look it up, it means a swarm. And really, if you look at it in more detail, it means a swarm of swarms. God said, "Let these creatures abound." It means many. God created a swarm of creatures in the water. They just sprang into existence as He spoke these words. Morris says this, a quote, "The first introduction of animal life was not a fragile blob of protoplasm that happened to come together in response to electrical discharges over a primeval ocean, as evolutionists believe. Rather, the waters suddenly swarmed abundantly with swarming creatures." Evolutionists say this. This is from the Smithsonian Ocean, its website. It says, "Marine life originated in the ocean at least 3.5 billion years ago. The first life forms were single-celled microbes that likely lived near hydrothermal vents, where they used minerals from the hot water to obtain energy." Now, we talked about this back when we looked at how God created the oceans and the belief that these hydrothermal vents that are under the ocean is where life first started. That's not the case. That is the belief that, minerals from these vents kind of worked with cells to create these blobs that then became fish and then worked their way to land, and all of these organisms then created plants. That's crazy. The simple answer and the logical answer, as we've talked about over and over again, the supernatural being created all things. God spoke and they sprang forth. And that's amazing to think about. God spoke and said these living creatures started to abound, to swarm in the ocean, and they did. This would indicate that the waters instantly thrived with a great number of different species of living creatures. Here are some facts. According to the World Register of Marine Species, it is estimated that there is 242,000 known species of ocean life or marine life. That's what is known. According to their estimates, there's really a total number of marine species that range from 0.3 million to 2.2 million. They don't know. But what's crazy is that on average, there's about 2,000 new species of marine life found every year. That's a lot. God said, let these living creatures abound, and they did. Now, we don't know exactly how many species there are. There's an estimate there. But just to think about all the different things that God created in the ocean, it's estimated that 91% of the ocean species have not been classified. God created all these living creatures. And even think about the microorganisms in the water. It is believed there is roughly 30,000 or more microorganisms just in the drop of seawater. God created all of that. He spoke it into existence. So when we see that phrase, when God says, let the waters bring forth or to abound with living creatures, that's what he meant. All these different creatures that are in the ocean. We can go on and on about what they are, but we can talk about the fish and the different things and the microorganisms that are there. But I think it's interesting, verse 21. He says, so God created great sea creatures. So we have a difference. We have sea creatures or sea life in verse 20, living creatures. Then he tells us there is great sea creatures. Well, what are these great sea creatures? If you're looking at the ASV, it says great sea monsters. Well, that makes your mind go thinking, what is he talking about? The King James says whales. So great whales. Now, we know there's great whales in the ocean. The word whale, if you look it up in the Hebrew that's used there, it means a serpent, a dragon, or a sea monster. So, what is it talking about? Well, for what we know, one of the largest of the marine life is the blue whale. This is the Antarctic blue whale. The largest animal to have ever lived, the blue whales, grow up to 100 feet long and weigh over 200 tons. Now, there's other numbers. If you look in other places, there's some even larger numbers to that. It says their tongues can weigh as much as an elephant, and their hearts can weigh as much as a car. That is huge. Not only that, or an article done by the BBC said this, from 13 meters long, or 43 feet, carnivorous squid, to scuttling yeti crabs huddling near hydrothermal vents, to tusked whales dwelling thousands of feet down to avoid predatory orcas. Sizable marine animals new to science are still being documented every year. All these different animals that are in the sea, these living creatures that are in the sea, God created them. Now there's one notable one that we read of in Scripture that I love to look at, and that's in Job chapter 41. Let's turn over there. Job chapter 41. And look at verse 1 and 2. Job chapter 41, verse 1 and 2. Can you draw out Leviathan with a hook, or snare his tongue with a line which you lower? Can you put a reed through his nose, or pierce his jaw with a hook? Go down to verse 7. We're going to read several verses here. Can you fill his skin with harpoons, or his head with fishing spears? Go down to verse 13. Who can remove his outer coat? Who can approach him with a double bridle? Who can open the doors of his face with his terrible teeth all around? His rows of scales are his pride, shut up tightly as with a seal. One is so near another that no air can come between them. They are joined one to another. They stick together and cannot be parted. His sneezings flash forth light, and his eyes are like the eyelids of the morning. Out of his mouth goes burning lights. Sparks of fire shoot out. Smoke goes out of his nostrils as from a boiling pot, and burning rushes. He breathes kindles coals, and a flame goes out of his mouth. Strength dwells in his neck, and sorrow dances before him. The folds of his flesh are joined together. They are firm on him and cannot be moved. His heart is as hard as stone, and as hard as the lower millstone. When he raises himself up, the mighty are afraid. Because of his crashings, they are beside themselves. Though the sword reaches him, it cannot avail, nor does spear, dart, or javelin. Now, what is this creature? Well, Job tells us it's Leviathan. Or actually, it's God speaking here. God is saying it's Leviathan. Well, another place we see Leviathan talked about is in Psalm 104. Psalm 104 and verse 26. Psalm 104 and verse 26. It says, the ships sail about. There is that Leviathan which you have made to play there. So we see this reference to the Leviathan who is in the ocean. It says, how can you capture him? You can't throw a hook and grab him. But this Leviathan also breathes fire. It's pretty interesting. When you go back and look at the definition for the word great sea creatures, the whales, it says dragon or sea monster, serpent. Could it be talking about the Leviathan? It is. Pretty neat to think about. God, we don't see this kind of creature today. There's a lot of mystical or things that talked about dragons in the past in Asian cultures. Who knows? It could be. But it's interesting that God, in this time, he created all the sea creatures that we see. And then he created, as we see, possibly also the Leviathan, which we don't know exactly what it is. But God said, and these creatures abounded. And not only that, we looked at the sea. Now, the living creatures that are in the air. Look back at verse 20, Genesis chapter 1, verse 20 through 21. It says, and let birds fly above the earth across the face of the firmament of the heavens. And then verse 21, it says, and every winged bird according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. Just like the sea creatures, God created birds of all species to fly above the water and the land. BirdLife International says there are more than 11,000 species of birds, each with their own unique appearance and habits. Now, the evolutionists say this. Birds originally descended from reptiles. The word there, which I'm not going to try to pronounce, is the earliest known bird, which lived approximately 147 million years ago. This bird was so different to today's birds. Not only did it have a long bony tail, but it also had teeth. Kind of sounds like a pterodactyl. I think that's what they are. But they believe that birds then came from reptiles. But what did it say here? What did God say? He spoke, and they existed. And so we look at God creating on day 5. He created all the great sea creatures. He created the living things that are in the ocean. He created all the things that are in the air that fly above the land and the water. And so what did he say in verse 21? It says, and God saw that it was good. Just like he has with any other day of creation, God saw that it was good. And so then verse 22, it says, and God blessed him, saying, be fruitful and multiply, and fill the waters and the seas, and let birds multiply on the earth. So the evening and the morning was the 5th day. God said for these creatures to be fruitful and to multiply, to fill the earth. This is the first time we see that. This is the first time we see living creatures being created. And God says for them to fill the earth. Now, some things to think about before we move on to day 6. Notice these creatures were to reproduce after their own kind. It's important. It's been the theme throughout really all creation. When God created the plants, they were to bear fruit after their own kind. Their seed only produces that plant. You cannot plant a corn seed and have a peach tree come up. When you plant a corn seed, you're going to have a corn stalk. And so the same thing goes for living creatures. Fish do not grow into birds. And we can see that fact today. We've just recently hatch some eggs from some chickens that we have that Cassie's been raising. Where's she at? Cassie's been raising. And when they hatched, they were just like their mothers. They were not something else. We did not end up with lizards. We ended up with chickens. And so creatures were to reproduce after their own kind. Plants and vegetation were created first. Why is that the case? Why did God create plants and vegetation first? Well, evolutionary theory says that marine organisms evolved first, then land plants, and later birds. How would that work? As we talked about when we looked at how the vegetation was created, it needed to be there for what? For these animals and things to survive. Evolution says it's opposite. Doesn't make any sense. See, this gave the fish and birds something to eat. This gave birds something to nest in. God knew what he was doing when he created this earth. And so then, verse 23, that completed the fifth day. So the evening and the morning were the fifth day. So that concludes day 5. Now I want to look at day 6. And that's really verse 24 through the end of the chapter. And so we're going to just read parts of this as we go through. But verse 24, it says, Then God said, Let the earth bring forth a living creature, according to its kind, cattle and creeping things and beasts of the earth, each according to its kind. And it was so. And God made the beasts of the earth according to its kind, cattle according to its kind, and everything that creeps on the earth according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. So God created animals. Now we have 3 classes of land animals that were created. The first one is creeping things, my favorite. Creeping things. This is the word here used means a reptile or any other rapidly moving animal that creeps in a sense things on this earth. So that would include reptiles and things like that, but also would include insects. And then my favorite, spiders. Why they were created, I thought they were created after sin entered the world, but they weren't. But spiders, insects. Wikipedia says this, evolution, and this is in regards to evolution, says insects are thought to have evolved from a group of crustaceans. The first insects were land-bound, but about 400 million years ago, in the Devonian period, one lineage of insects evolved flight, the first animals to do so. So they said that insects evolved from that goo, from that thermal place in the ocean, those minerals coming together with making that glob. They said that insects came from that, and then one started to evolve into having wings and then flying. Doesn't make any sense. Science Direct says this: insects were the first animals to involve flight around 406 million years ago. They also evolved before the first known pteropods, the earliest vertebrates on land, which lived 350 million years ago. Makes no sense. Makes no sense. See, God created insects at the same time as he created animals. So God created the creeping things. Then the next one is he says he created cattle. Now, I like this definition. Strong's describes cattle as this, the word here. Properly a dumb beast. If you've ever dealt with cattle, they're dumb beasts. I just think that's funny, especially any large animal. So this word cattle in other definitions sometimes mean domestic, the domesticated animals. So animals like cattle that are used for food and things like that we have today would include that. But then the last one is beast. The word beast there means really just wild animals. So in creation, God classified all animals into 3 things: the creeping things, the cattle, those things that are domesticated in a sense, and then the wild animals. That would include wolves and lions and things like that. And so everything was made, this is important, made according to its kind. The cattle produce cattle. Cows produce calves. And so, insects, spiders produce spiders, unfortunately. Everything is made according to its kind and produced according to its kind. Notice animals were created separate from humanity, from humans, on the same day, but in a different text. They did not evolve from animals. And so that's verse 26. God created man. Notice verse 26 and 27. It says, then God said, notice, then, after he created the animals, after he created the creeping things, the cattle, and the beasts of this world, he said, then God said, let the earth bring forth the living creature according to its kind. Then God said, verse 26, sorry. Let us make man in our image, according to our likeness. Let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the air, and over the cattle, over all earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him, male and female he created them. Now we looked at this verse in our introductory focus of creation, and the fact that the use of the words here, and the word us, meaning that all of the Godhead was involved in this. And so that's important, which we've already focused on. I'm not going to focus on that this morning. But what I want to focus on is that God said, let us make man in our image. God, separately from animals and from every other living creature, created man. Now, he created him last for a reason. He created him last because he is to rule over all of creation. God made man in his image according to his likeness. Those are really the same phrase. Saying it twice but in two different ways. He's saying God created us, humanity, in his image and in his likeness. Now the question is, in what way is man made in the image of God? In what way is man made in the likeness of God? Well, John 4 and verse 24 tells us that God is spirit. And they that worship him must worship him in spirit and in truth. Is God physical? Does God have flesh and bones? Look at Luke chapter 24. Luke chapter 24. And look at verse 39. Luke 24 and verse 39. It says, behold my hands and my feet, that it is I myself. Handle me and see, for spirit does not have flesh and bones as you see as I have. Jesus saying there, spirit, God being spirit, does not have hands and flesh and bones. Now, Jesus came to this earth, John chapter 1, and put on that likeness of man, came and lived in this world as you and I, but God does not have flesh and bones. So how then are we made in the likeness of God? It means man's not made in the physical image of God, but in a different way. See, man and humanity has a soul or spirit, and that's what's important. God being spirit means he's eternal. That means you and I, being created in his image, have an eternal part of us a part of us that will live on for eternity. This means having a soul and spirit, we can reason, we can think, we can understand, we can plan, etc. Isn't that what God does? God thinks, God reasons, God understands, God plans. That's how we are made in his image. We are given a likeness as of God. We have given a soul that does not cease. So go to Matthew chapter 25. Matthew chapter 25 and verse 46. Jesus at the end of this parable says this, and these will go into everlasting punishment, but the righteous into eternal life. You and I have a soul that never ceases. In 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, and verse 13 and 18 through 18 says the same thing. That our soul, our body dies, but our soul will live on somewhere in eternity. This means we have a soul that will spend eternity somewhere. Now, do animals have this eternal soul? No. Now, some want to believe they do. And, even using the word here, God says created living beings. Living, that word living means having breath, having life, having blood pumping through their body. The Bible called them living animals. This refers to them being alive and breathing. But can an animal reason? Can an animal plan in a sense of you and I do? Can an animal sin? No. The soul, or the breath and life of animals, notice this in Ecclesiastes chapter 3. Ecclesiastes chapter 3. Look at verse 21. Ecclesiastes 3 and verse 21. It says, "Who knows the spirit of the sons of men which go upward, and the spirit of the animal which goes down to the earth?" See, the soul of animals, the breath and life, goes to the ground. But where does the soul of man go? To an eternal home. It goes to God. Animals do not go over this rainbow bridge and live eternally with their owners forever. See, God created us different. God created us in His image. God created us to have dominion over all creation. And so God created man, male and female. If you go over to Genesis chapter 2 and verse 21 through 22, we also see on this same day that God created women. God created female. Notice in verse 21, he says, "And the Lord God caused a deep sleep to fall on Adam, and he slept, and he took one of his ribs and closed up its flesh in its place. Then the rib which the Lord God had taken from man, he made into a woman. He brought her to the man." And so God created male and female. He created two genders, and that's it. Now that's something difficult for our world to want to believe. Obviously not the majority. But many want to believe that we have more than two genders, but God created us with only two. This is evident in all of the creatures and the animals that God created. He created male and female. They were to reproduce. And so man was created male, or humanity was created male and female. Man is says to have dominion over all creation. God created everything in an order. Clark in his commentary stated this. This is an interesting quote. He says, "He prepared everything for his subsistence, convenience, and pleasure before he brought him into being, so that comparing little with great things, the house was built, furnished, and amply stored by the time the destined tenant was ready to occupy it." So he compares the earth into a sense as to a house. The house was built, the house was furnished, the house was given everything that was needed for the tenant to move in and to live. And that's you and I. God created everything for humanity to enjoy. Here's another quote. "When one considers the creation as a whole, he sees the creation being with the lesser and constantly moving to the greater until it reaches the crown jewel of God's creation. Human beings. Nothing else in the creation is equal to man. Rather, all is inferior to him." God created his crown jewel on day 6 after he created everything else. And that is you and I. Why do you think about it? Evolution teaches that we're no different than the rest of creation. It makes you wonder why people treat each other the way they do. Why do animals have more rights than humans? Why is it that animal activists say that we can't eat meat? Because they want to believe that we all came from the same thing. They want to believe that animals and humans are therefore the same, but they're not. See, God created man to have dominion over all his creation. And that means we have a responsibility to take care of it. It means we have a responsibility to tend it, to care for his creation, and not abuse it. In verse 28, I know we're running low on time. 28, says, "Then God said, let us," or verse 28 says, "Then God blessed them. And God said to them, be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it. Have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the air, and over every living thing that moves on the earth." God blessed his creation. His first blessing was for humanity to multiply. It was to fill the earth. The second was to subdue it, to have dominion, to rule over it, to tend it, to keep it. That was his blessing. And then verse 29 says, "And God said, see, I have given you every herb that yields seed, which is on the face of all the earth, and every tree whose fruit yields seed. To you shall it be for food. Also to every beast of the earth, to every bird of the air, and to everything that creeps on the earth, in which there is life, I have given every green herb for food." And it was so. Interesting. Man and animals were created vegetarians. Notice that? It wasn't until Genesis chapter 9, verse 1 through 3, after Noah got off the ark. Notice what God says in Genesis chapter 9. In verse 1 through 3. "So God blessed Noah and his sons and said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. And the fear of you and the dread of you shall be on every beast of the earth, on every bird of the air, and on all that move on the earth, and all the fish of the sea. They are given into your hand. Every moving thing that lives shall be food for you. I have given you all things, even as the green herbs." Thankfully, after the flood, we are able to eat bacon. We're able to eat beef. We'll be able to eat meat. But God designed us, animals and humans, in the beginning to eat the herbs of the field. And I think that has a lot to do with that, if we had more time, with when you look at Noah and the ark, how the animals stayed there together and lived together. And so, verse 31, as we finish, says, "And God saw everything that he had made, and indeed it was very good. So evening and the morning were the sixth day." Every other time we have seen this phrase, he says it was good. But this time, once he has created all things, he has created the crown of his creation, which is humanity. He says it's very good. God looked at his creation and saw that it was very good. And so God gives us so much evidence to prove that he created all things. He created man to have dominion over his creation. That means that we have a responsibility to take care of it. That means we are also the crown of God's creation, and we think about that. God created us as his crown of creation, in his image, in his likeness, with an eternal soul. And if we pull from this day, in day 6, something to pull from that is that we have a lifetime to decide where that eternal soul will end up. Now, how long is that lifetime? We don't know. It could be short. We could have a full life. But we only have this time and this life to prepare for where our eternal soul will end. We need to make sure that we're ready. See, in 1 Timothy chapter 2, Paul said, God desires for all man, all humanity, to come to the knowledge of the truth and to be saved. God cares about you. You as humans. Not animals, not the plants, not the fish of the sea. You as humans are his crown of his creation. He has given you an eternal soul that can live with him forever. And he wants you to be there with him. The only way to do that is to obey his plan of salvation, to put on Christ in baptism, to be put into his church where your sins are washed away. And if you have not done that, I encourage you to not wait, to not put it off, but do it now as we stand and as we